Tonight, was Henry VIII really history's worst husband, or did a sultan named Ibrahim make him look innocent? Welcome to Historical Versus, the channel that puts history on trial. Two royal husbands enter the arena, one English, one Ottoman, and we're asking a question with a twist ending you won't see coming. Sultan Ibrahim the Mad supposedly executed his entire harem, 280 women gone. But here's the problem. Henry VIII's wife-killing is exhaustively documented. Trial transcripts, death warrants, ambassadors' letters describing the exact angle of the sword. Ibrahim's massacre? It might be the most enduring lie in Ottoman history. We're judging on 5 weighted criteria. The percentages are locked. The tiebreaker goes to evidentiary reliability because history's verdict depends on what actually survives in the record. But the reasons behind these weights you'll discover as we put history on trial. Now, you probably clicked expecting a body count blowout. 2 versus 280. Easy math. Ibrahim wins. But here's what this episode will deliver that others won't. The math doesn't work when one side's numbers are written in ink and the other side's are written in rumor. By the end, you'll understand why the king with the smaller number might actually be the bigger monster. First, the stakes, then case versus case, finally, the scoreboard that settles it. England, 1509. A 17-year-old prince ascends the throne. He's charming, athletic, deeply religious. The Pope literally calls him defender of the faith. He'll go on to have 6 wives. 2 divorced, 2 beheaded, 1 died, 1 survived. You've probably heard the rhyme. British schoolchildren still sing it. Now shift east. Constantinople, 1640. A 24-year-old prince emerges from a locked apartment where he's spent 22 years. 22 years convinced that every footstep outside his door was an executioner coming to strangle him. His brothers died that way, his nephews died that way. He survived only because everyone thought he was too mentally broken to matter. They called his prison the cage. Keep that in mind. We'll come back to what 22 years of psychological torture does to a man. Henry VIII ruled for 38 years. Ibrahim ruled for 8. Henry had 6 wives. Ibrahim had, depending on who you believe, 8 official favorites, plus a harem of perhaps 280 concubines. One king used the law as a murder weapon. The other allegedly used silk sacks and seawater. But here's the detail I want you to carry forward. Henry imported a specialist executioner from France just to kill his wife. A French swordsman shipped across the channel at royal expense for one specific beheading. Why? What kind of man arranges a mercy killing while committing a murder? We'll get there. First up, the king who turned Parliament into an execution squad. You're a nobleman in Tudor England, May 1536. The king has summoned you to serve on a jury. The defendant? The Queen of England. The charges? Adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, treason against the crown, conspiracy to murder the king himself. You take your seat, you look at the evidence, and you realize something chilling. The dates don't add up. Anne Boleyn allegedly committed adultery on days she was recovering from childbirth, in locations she never visited, with men who were demonstrably elsewhere. One of the accused confessed, but only after being stretched on the rack until his shoulders dislocated. You're going to convict her anyway. Because here's the thing about Tudor justice. The king doesn't need evidence. He needs a jury willing to sign whatever he puts in front of them. And you're looking at the Duke of Norfolk, Anne's own uncle, presiding over this trial, her family member reading out the death sentence. Exhibit: Parliament as accomplice. This is Henry VIII's genius. He didn't murder his wives in dark corridors. He murdered them in broad daylight, with parliamentary stamps and legal seals, dressed in the ceremonial robes of English law. The 1534 Treason Act made it a capital crime to slander the king's marriage. Translation: if someone accuses you of sleeping with the Queen and the king decides to believe them, you've committed treason by existing. The law was a loaded weapon Henry built for himself. Anne Boleyn was the first person he used it on. She wouldn't be the last. Now let's talk about the swordsman. You remember that detail from the setup. Henry imported a specialist executioner from Calais, shipped him across the English Channel at considerable expense, a French expert in the art of decapitation by sword, not axe, sword, specifically for Anne Boleyn. Why? Because a sword is faster, cleaner. One stroke and it's over. The axe can take 2 swings, 3. Sometimes the executioner misses entirely on the first blow. Henry had seen botched executions. He didn't want that for Anne. Let that sink in. The man who fabricated charges of incest on his wife, who had her own brother executed beside her, who was already engaged to Jane Seymour before Anne's head hit the straw. This man arranged a mercy killing. He cared enough about her suffering to import a specialist. He just didn't care enough to not kill her. Exhibit: mercy, outsourced. There's a word for that. It's not mercy. It's control. Anne Boleyn knelt on the scaffold at the Tower of London on May 19, 1536. No blindfold at first. She was composed. Eyewitnesses said she maintained her innocence with a dignity that made hardened courtiers weep. When the blindfold finally went on, the swordsman did something clever. He called out to his assistant, "Bring me the sword," and Anne instinctively turned her head toward the voice. She never saw the blade coming from the other direction. One stroke, done. The first English queen ever executed by her own husband. Henry wore yellow that day. He went boating with Jane Seymour that afternoon. Now, a fair defense. Maybe Henry truly believed Anne was guilty. Maybe Cromwell deceived him. Maybe the king was a victim of his own paranoid advisors. We love to blame the advisors. The dramas and novels tell us Cromwell was the mastermind, pulling the strings while a tragic Henry sat confused. Objection. Cromwell was the weapon, but Henry was the hand that swung it. Here's why that doesn't hold. Within 3 weeks, Henry had Anne arrested, tried, annulled, and executed. Her alleged crimes spanned 3 years. His investigation lasted 17 days. That's not justice, that's a deadline. He needed Anne gone before she could miscarry again, before her faction could regroup, before Jane Seymour got bored of waiting. Every Tudor historian worth their salt agrees. The trial was a sham. The charges were fabricated. Anne Boleyn was innocent. But she was inconvenient. And in Henry's England, inconvenient wives had short lifespans. One stroke, done. But she wasn't the last. 6 years later, it happens again. You're Catherine Howard now. You're somewhere between 16 and 19 years old. Nobody bothered recording your exact birthday. You've just married a man 3 times your age, a man with an ulcerated leg that smells so foul, servants change his bandages multiple times daily, a man who calls you his rose without a thorn. The defense might plead medical incompetence. They'll tell you about the 1536 jousting accident, 2 hours unconscious, a likely traumatic brain injury that turned a golden prince into a paranoid tyrant. But brain damage explains the impulse. It does not excuse the meticulously filed paperwork. But you have a past, not a criminal past, but a tragic one. You were raised in a neglectful household with minimal supervision. When you were just a child, your music teacher preyed on you. When you were barely 15, an older man named Francis Derham targeted you. Today, we would call this grooming and abuse. In Tudor England, they called it your death sentence. Because here's the obscure law Henry pushed through Parliament after your arrest. It became treason for any future queen to conceal her sexual history from the king, an ex post facto law designed specifically to condemn a teenager for things that happened to her before she ever met Henry. You didn't get a trial. Anne Boleyn at least got the theatre of justice. You got a bill of attainment, Parliament simply declaring you guilty without evidence, without testimony, without a chance to speak in your defense. You were guilty of being a victim who made desperate choices in an impossible situation. Exhibit: justice by paperwork. The night before your execution, you asked for the chopping block to be brought to your cell. You wanted to practice, to make sure you laid your head down correctly. You were a teenager so terrified of embarrassing yourself on the scaffold that you rehearsed your own death. February 13th, 1542. You walked to the scaffold so weak with fear that guards had to hold you upright. You managed a few words. You asked for mercy on your soul. Then the axe fell. You were buried next to Anne Boleyn in the Tower Chapel. 2 of Henry's queens, 2 graves. Exhibit: 1 pattern, 2 graves. That's what elevates Henry from murderer to something worse. He did it twice, 6 years apart, 2 different women, 2 different methods, trial for Anne, attainment for Catherine, but the same result. A king who learned that killing wives was an acceptable solution to marital problems. No English monarch before or after executed a spouse. Henry did it twice. That's not an aberration, that's a policy. 2 wives, documented beyond any doubt, primary sources, trial records, eyewitness accounts, ambassadors' letters written while the blood was still wet. Now, here's the question that should be haunting you. What if Ibrahim's 280 never happened at all? You're a concubine in the imperial harem, Constantinople, 1647, past midnight. The chief black eunuch moves through the corridors with a torch, pulling women from their beds. No explanation, just orders. You're herded into a marble courtyard, the smell of rosewater and fear. Somewhere nearby, Sultan Ibrahim is screaming about betrayal. Someone told him one of his women slept with another man. He doesn't know which one. He doesn't care. Silk sacks appear, heavy weights, heavy stones used to weigh down traitors. According to the legend, 280 women went into those sacks that night, tied, gagged, thrown into the black water one by one for hours. One woman supposedly survived. Pulled from the sea by a passing fisherman, she'd clawed through the silk and kept herself afloat until dawn. Exhibit: silk sacks and seawater. It's a hell of a story. Here's the problem. It probably never happened. But before we dismantle the legend, you need to understand how a man becomes capable of something like this, even in rumor. You need to understand the cage. Imagine you're Ibrahim. You're 2 years old when your father dies. You're 8 when your half-brother Osman II is strangled by his own soldiers, dragged from the throne and murdered with a bowstring. You're 12 when your full brother Murad IV takes power. Murad is terrified of rivals. One by one he executes your other brothers, strangles them in their beds, has their bodies dumped in unmarked graves. You watch the family shrink. You count the survivors on one hand, then on 3 fingers.
then two, then just you. Murad doesn't kill you, not because he loves you, because he thinks you're already broken, too mentally fragile to ever threaten him. So instead, he locks you in the kafis, the cage. It's a suite of rooms in Topkapi Palace, comfortable enough, silk cushions, decent food, windows that let in light but not hope. You can't leave. You can't see anyone except a handful of deaf-mute servants. You can't know what's happening in the outside world. Every footstep in the corridor could be your execution coming. You live like this for 22 years. Exhibit: 22 years, one door. 22 years of absolute isolation, convinced every day might be your last. No education in governance, no preparation for rule, just silence, paranoia, and the certain knowledge that your family solves succession problems with murder. Then, in 1640, Murad dies. You're the only male heir left. Guards come to your door. They tell you you're the Sultan now. You don't believe them. You refuse to leave. You're convinced it's a trick, that the moment you step outside, they'll strangle you like they strangled Osman. They have to show you Murad's corpse before you'll accept that you're not about to die. That's the man who allegedly drowned 280 women, a man who spent his formative years marinating in trauma and terror. The cage didn't just imprison Ibrahim, it manufactured him. But here's the thing about legends: they need evidence to survive, and Ibrahim's doesn't have any. Let's start with what should exist but doesn't. Ottoman court records were meticulous. They tracked expenses, appointments, punishments, deaths. If 280 women had been executed in a single night, there would be administrative traces, requisitions for sacks, payment to the executioners, notations about removing bodies, adjustments to the harem payroll. There's nothing. Exhibit: the archive says nothing. The Ottoman chronicler Naima wrote extensively about Ibrahim's reign, his excesses, his incompetence, his eventual overthrow. Naima recorded embarrassing details that didn't flatter the dynasty. He mentioned Ibrahim's bizarre obsessions and his execution of officials on paranoid whims. He never mentioned a harem massacre. Neither did any other Ottoman primary source. So, where does the story come from? European travelers, diplomats writing home with second-hand gossip. Paul Reichout, an English observer in the 1660s, mentioned something vague about Ibrahim and concubines meeting watery ends. The number grew in the retelling. By the 19th century, Western historians were confidently citing 280 as established fact. It was the perfect bedtime story for a Europe terrified of the Turk. It comforted them to believe the Sultan was a cartoon monster drowning women in sacks, because it distracted them from the fact that their own Christian kings were chopping off heads in London public squares. Exhibit: telephone, not testimony. It wasn't fact, it was legend inflation, the historical equivalent of a game of telephone where each teller makes the story slightly more dramatic. Modern Ottoman scholars, the people who actually read the original Turkish and Arabic sources, treat the mass drowning as apocryphal. Rejected by several historians as invented or exaggerated, writes one encyclopedia entry. No corroborating archival evidence, notes another. Now, let's play devil's advocate. Maybe something happened. It's possible Ibrahim had a few concubines executed. Palace intrigue was dangerous. Accusations of infidelity could be lethal. Perhaps he ordered 1 or 2 women killed in a fit of rage, and the story metastasized from there. If that's true, we're talking single digits, not 280, maybe not even 10. And here's the clincher. The women who should have died in this massacre didn't. Turhan Hatice, Ibrahim's principal consort, mother of his heir, survived his entire reign. She went on to become one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history, ruling as regent for her son Mehmed IV. If Ibrahim drowned all his harem, how did the most important woman in it escape unscathed? She wasn't pulled from the Bosphorus by a fisherman. She wasn't hiding in a closet. She was living openly in the palace, bearing Ibrahim's children, building political alliances. Because the massacre didn't happen, or if it did, it happened to a tiny fraction of the rumored number, quiet enough that primary sources ignored it, small enough that the principal consorts weren't touched. So where does that leave us? Henry VIII, 2 documented wife executions, trial records, death warrants, bodies buried in the Tower Chapel. Sultan Ibrahim, 0 to maybe a handful, with the legendary 280 dissolving into probable myth. The man with the smaller number is suddenly looking like the only man with a number at all.
The cases have been made, the evidence is in, it's time for the final showdown. 5 criteria, 2 rulers, 1 verdict. Let's run the numbers. On documented death count weighted at 35%, this is the heart of the question. How many wives or consorts did each ruler actually verifiably execute? Henry VIII scores 9 out of 10, 2 confirmed executions. Anne Boleyn, 1536, Catherine Howard, 1542. Trial records, death warrants, eyewitness accounts, burial sites you can visit today. The only reason he doesn't get a perfect 10 is that 2 is still a relatively small number. He just happens to be the only English king on the scoreboard at all. Sultan Ibrahim scores 2 out of 10. The legendary 280 collapses under scrutiny to probably 0, maybe a handful. We can't confirm a single named victim. 2 points for the possibility that something small occurred, but possibility isn't proof. Henry leads. On evidentiary reliability, weighted at 25%, how much can we trust the sources? Henry scores 10 out of 10. Perfect marks. We have primary documents, trial transcripts, acts of parliament, letters from Ambassador Chapuis written while the executioner's blade was still being cleaned, multiple independent sources. No serious historians dispute that these executions happened exactly as described. Ibrahim scores 2 out of 10. His massacre exists in later chronicles, European travelers' gossip, and 19th century retellings. Ottoman court records, the sources that would know, are silent. Modern scholars call it legend. Some call it propaganda invented to justify his overthrow. Henry extends the lead. On intent and agency, weighted at 20%. Did they personally drive these killings, or were they puppets of circumstance? Henry scores 10 out of 10. He wasn't manipulated. He wasn't deceived. He approved the investigations. He signed the death warrants. He hand-selected Anne Boleyn's executioner, imported from France at personal expense. Remember that open loop? The French swordsman wasn't mercy. It was micromanagement. Henry controlled every detail of his wives' deaths, because controlling people is what Henry did. Even in murder, he demanded precision. Ibrahim scores 4 out of 10. If the drowning happened, yes, he gave the order, but his agency is clouded by probable insanity. 22 years in the cage left him psychologically shattered. And if it didn't happen, there's no agency to assess. We are scoring him for documented cruelty toward officials and general volatility, but we can't credit him for a massacre that probably never occurred. On legal and procedural framework, weighted at 10%, did they bother with due process or skip straight to murder? Henry scores 8 out of 10. He used the law, twisted it, weaponized it, made Parliament an accomplice, but he used it. Anne Boleyn got a trial, even if it was rigged. Catherine Howard got a bill of attainment, even if it was retroactive. Henry wanted his murders to look legitimate. He cared about the paperwork. Ibrahim scores 1 out of 10. If 280 women were drowned in one night, there was no trial, no fatwa, no formal process whatsoever, just a screaming sultan and a pile of silk sacks. Even by Ottoman standards, where sultans had enormous personal power, this would have been pure lawless violence. On institutionalization and pattern, weighted at 10%, was this a one-time aberration or repeated behavior? Henry scores 7 out of 10. He did it twice, 6 years apart. 2 different queens, 2 different methods, same outcome. That's not a mistake, that's a policy.
After Catherine Howard, he even passed a law requiring future queens to disclose their sexual history. He institutionalized lessons learned from killing his own wives. Ibrahim scores 2 out of 10. The alleged massacre was a single event. If it happened, it was an isolated psychotic break, not a sustained practice. He didn't have time to establish a pattern. His reign lasted 8 years, and the legend places the drowning near the end. 1 data point, and a dubious one at that. The final tally. Henry VIII, 9.15 out of 10. Sultan Ibrahim, 2.30 out of 10. The gap is 6.85. No tiebreaker needed. By every metric that matters, confirmed deaths, reliable evidence, personal responsibility, legal manipulation, repeated behavior, Henry VIII dominates this contest. The king who supposedly killed fewer wives is the king who definitely killed them. And that's the final lesson. From Ibrahim's cage, 22 years of isolation manufactured a madman. But it also manufactured a legend, a story so outrageous that later writers couldn't resist repeating it, couldn't resist inflating it, couldn't resist using it to justify why the Janissaries were right to strangle their sultan.
Legends persist because they're useful. Ibrahim's massacre justified his overthrow. Henry's executions needed no justification, they were the law. Henry VIII wins. Not because he killed more wives, but because we can prove he killed any at all. We started this episode with a paradox. 2 versus 280. The math seemed obvious. Sultan Ibrahim, the alleged mass murderer, should have crushed the competition. But history doesn't care about legends. History cares about evidence. And the evidence told a different story. Henry VIII executed 2 queens in broad daylight, with trial transcripts and death warrants, and ambassadors writing home about the precise angle of the blade. He turned Parliament into an accessory. He imported a French swordsman to ensure his wife died quickly, not out of mercy, but out of control. He did it twice, learned from the first killing, and built laws to make the second one easier. Sultan Ibrahim spent 22 years in a locked room waiting to be strangled. He emerged broken. He threw gold into the sea. He covered his palace in fur. He may have lashed out at his harem in fits of rage, but the legendary massacre, the 280 women in silk sacks, dissolves under scrutiny into Ottoman silence, European gossip, and centuries of embellishment. One king left a paper trail, the other left a campfire story. The scoreboard alone settled it, no tiebreaker needed. Here's the thought I want you to carry out of this episode. Ink outlasts rumor. The documented monster wins. That's the dark irony. Henry VIII is history's most famous wife killer, not despite his meticulous records, but because of them. He wanted his murders to look legal. He wanted the paperwork filed. He wanted future generations to see that he followed the rules, his rules, written specifically to let him kill inconvenient queens. Ibrahim's legend grew precisely because no one wrote it down. The silence created space for imagination. 280 became the number because it was shocking enough to justify strangling a sultan, exotic enough to titillate European readers, and impossible to disprove because no Ottoman scribe recorded what actually happened in the harem that night. Henry's legacy is a warning. Beware the tyrant who makes murder legal. Ibrahim's legacy is a question. How much of what we believe about history is just the loudest story? The verdict is in, but history is never that simple. Who gets your vote? Was Henry's calculated cruelty worse than Ibrahim's chaotic madness, even if the madness was exaggerated? Does intent matter more than body count? Does a proven 2 outweigh a legendary 280? Cast your judgment in the comments below.
If you want another royal scandal, one where the evidence is deliciously abundant on both sides, check out our episode on Cleopatra versus Catherine the Great. 2 queens, 2 reputations destroyed by their enemies, 1 satisfying verdict. Subscribe for our next trial, Vlad the Impaler versus Elizabeth Bathory. Who was the real monster? That verdict drops soon. Thanks for watching Historical Verses.